kind of talking about the home defense plan here. And one of the first things you talked about was like barricading instead of just going out and trying to find the person. And that was crazy because that blew my mind like right off the bat, because I've even done that, gone, hear a noise in the night. But
if you think there's a threat out there in your house and you've got your family in a room, why would you go expose yourself to danger when you can lock the door, call the police? You've got your gun, you've got your flashlight, got your medical kit, you got your 911 call's been made, your family's in there with you. Stay safe, stay secure. If the bad guy kicks the door in, shoot him.
Welcome to Trigger Discipline, firearms knowledge for the novice, curious, and the experienced. We're your hosts, Nick and Pete. We believe that firearms don't have to be dangerous and terrifying. Firearms are not only a vital tool in our world, but they can be safely enjoyed with just the littlest of effort by the user. Welcome to another episode of Trigger Discipline. I'm your host, Nick.
All right, so on this episode of the Trigger Discipline podcast, we brought Rob Pincus on to talk about the role of, I guess, children and firearms. It's kind of a complicated role, but normally at this point, we'd ask you to provide a little background on yourselves, but I think that could probably be a whole episode itself based on what I've learned. So if possible, could you give a brief background on yourself?
Yeah, basically, and especially as it pertains to tonight's, conversation. I mean, I grew up with guns and very little adult supervision using the guns. Honestly, it was a lifelong passion for me, shooting and firearms. My dad was a police officer, but he was one of those police officers for whom the gun was just one of the tools. He wasn't a shooter. He wasn't an avid hunter or anything like that. So I really just sort of as an anomaly in my family, and an anomaly even in my friend group growing up in South Jersey, took a liking to shooting and an interest in firearms, and thought that I would end up in some kind of armed professional, job, whether it was security or law enforcement or in the military. I dabbled in all three and ended up finding out that I really liked teaching. That came from a love of learning, from a love of going to classes. And in 2001, the summer of 2001, I left full-time law enforcement to teach full-time. I had been working in the industry for quite some time. I had been teaching, been writing some magazines by then already, starting in the late 90s. And then, of course, 9/11 happened and the whole landscape of the private sector training community changed. And it was, kind of right place, right time as far as that goes, and started doing a lot of very high-end training and really found my niche in the teaching world. And from there, went on to be on some TV shows, published 9 books now, including the latest children's book. And like I said, I really love teaching and being an educator. And then that grew into being an advocate and being someone who educates people about gun rights and responsibilities, fighting for our rights, but also reminding our community of the responsibilities we have. And a lot of those revolve around children, whether they're our children or other people's kids. I have 2 kids of my own. They're both here in the house with me. One's 24 and one is 4.5. And I also have a 3-year-old granddaughter. And I've been married several times, and I've actually, I kind of get people to like sink in how many times I've had kids in the house with guns and kind of what stages they've been through. I've made, with a kid in the house, the transition from middle school to high school 7 times, if you count the step kids. So dealt with the teenagers, the curious kids, the friends, the homes that were very busy and had a lot of kids in and out, and homes where it was, kids that were home alone while people were work, or certainly while I was traveling. So we dealt with a lot of these issues, and the way I deal with them has certainly evolved. And for my older daughter, who's 24, and my younger daughter, who's 4, they're growing up in very, very different environments as pertains to firearms. And even with my older daughter, it was very different from the way I grew up with my access to firearms. So it's an evolving process, but it's certainly a conversation I think it's very important for us to have, including the fact that none of us are perfect, and we all are doing the best we can, or at least should be.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So I started my firearm journey probably a couple of years ago, and my kids were already 9 and 5 at that point. So there's some different lessons to learn there when there's already kids in the house versus if you already have firearms, and that's when you decide to have kids. But that's why I'm here, and that's why I have you on the show, to help people like me and any of our listeners learn the ropes.
A few years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago now, we started a course, little seminar course called the Family Firearm Safety Seminar. And it was designed to be a 3 to 4 hour course for families that were probably in exactly the situation you were in a few years ago, where you were considering bringing firearms in the house, or you wanted to bring firearms in the house, but you had kids, and you certainly knew like those two things together can be tragic. But also there's hundreds of millions of kids that have firearms in their homes without any problem whatsoever. So it's sort of about learning the best practices and getting educated. When we stood that class up, actually at the Bristlecone Shooting Center in Colorado, in Denver, was where we first launched that program. The first few classes, we realized that the target audience was exactly who your family, probably was. Any kids from 6 years old to 16 could come for free. Parents were encouraged to bring the kids. It was $50 a family. We just wanted them to get in there, get a live fire experience, and sort of have a roundtable discussion about what their concerns were and share some ideas with them. And then what we found out was the overwhelming majority of the people that came to the class were actually already firearms owners with kids in the house who were just genuinely worried about or excited about, I guess, finding out better ways to live with kids and guns. And it was really gratifying to see that it was people inside the community that, ostensibly had been living with kids and guns for years that were still looking to do it better and more responsibly, who showed up to the class. Certainly we had new firearms families as well, but it's just really important that we are policing our own, we are educating our own, and we're encouraging people to meet their responsibilities as gun owners.
Yeah, that's awesome, because you see almost every anti-gun talking point is just, it's based on gun users as being reckless people who don't know how to use their firearms properly, and just seeing that those are the types of people that go to that class just makes it, proves that firearm owners out there in the world are willing to keep learning and better themselves. And that's what, I know you strive for that. And that's what I'm trying to strive through our podcasts and through our social media and everything. But I guess we just want to get started. Probably the big question right off the bat. When is it appropriate to introduce children to firearms?
And like most of these questions, they're complex. There isn't an easy answer. Obviously the prevalence of firearms in the home or in the family becomes a really determinant factor there. But objectively, if you take out the variables of, is the father or mother a police officer and wearing a gun every day, or is it a hunting family? Is it a family with a range in their backyard? There's obviously some mitigating factors to the timing issues. But if we take all the environmental factors out and we just look at the individual child, it's really important that they have the intellectual capability to understand, any kind of firearms instruction or rules, that they have the maturity to understand the consequences of not following those rules, and sort of understand the idea of consequences and bad behavior and things like that, not just from a the gun can hurt you standpoint, but also from a disciplinary standpoint, because hopefully these kids, it's not like when you touch the hot stove and you learn, or when the cat scratches you because you played too rough, or the dog nips at you. You learn in those ways. Hopefully they never see a tragedy with a firearm. They never learn in that experiential way as young children what a firearm can do. So the only real discipline that you have, or the learning behavior you have, has to come from their maturity and their ability and willingness to listen to their family, listen to their parents. And then the last piece is the physical ability. This is really important in terms of not just talking to the kids about firearms and firearms rules and safety, but in terms of introducing children to the experience of shooting. They have to be physically capable of controlling the gun. And that's a really big one that I think that I know I've been guilty of missing in the past. And I think a lot of parents are really excited to get that picture of, them holding the gun up while the kid's pulling the trigger kind of thing.
Right.
Problem is that doesn't really teach the kid how to shoot. And, ultimately the worst case scenario of that is, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was a girl, let's call her about 10 years old, who was being introduced to machine gun shooting. And the quote instructor who was supervising it, put a short barreled submachine gun type gun in her hand, and where she clearly physically wasn't able to control the recoil, the gun came back up and she killed the guy. And that was an issue of she wasn't able to physically control that gun. We all have seen the videos of the, people with the, shooting the 12 gauge, coming back and falling out of their hands, or, banging their hearing protection off, or shooting a 44 caliber revolver and the revolver comes back and hits them in the head. Those kinds of things apply to adults too. And I think those are really the three touchstones, right? Is someone intellectually capable of understanding the instruction? Are they mature enough to handle the consequences of not doing what they're supposed to be doing? Are they aware of those consequences, not doing what they're supposed to be doing, following directions? And are they physically capable of controlling the gun the way you're going to introduce it and whatever gun you're going to introduce them to? Those are really the 3 rules for a 4-year-old or a 40-year-old and everybody in between. And then, of course, when we deal with the elderly, it's the same thing. We have some of the same physical concerns as well as intellectual or mental processing capabilities. If someone's drunk, you wouldn't take them to the range because they don't have the mental processing capability to be responsible at that time. So it's not an easy question to answer. As a general rule, I will tell parents that, if there's guns in the house and the kids are in any way capable of getting access to where those guns are going to be, you need to lock them up, right? And I'm talking about a 3-year-old that might climb up on top of the counter, pull the drawers open, climb on the counter, reach up because you left your backpack on the counter. They are on the backpack. Now they're on top of the refrigerator where you keep your holstered gun. I don't care if it's double action. I don't care if it's safety on. I don't care if it's a level 3 retention holster. If the kid can ever touch the gun, that's when you need to start worrying about staging and storage, to prevent unauthorized access. And probably when you need to start thinking about talking to the kids in some way about the presence of the guns, because you could screw up and they need to know what that item actually is, right? And then so anywhere from that 3, 4, 5-year-old up to, if you have guns in the house and you haven't talked to them by middle school, something's wrong. You're just asking for a tragedy if you have not talked to your kids about gun safety. Really, any parents talking to any kids about gun safety, whether you have guns in the home or not. I think it's an important conversation in America where there are 500 million guns potentially, and 50 million families with guns, over 100 million gun owners. We need to be talking to our kids about guns by the time they're 10, 11, 12 years old, just from a practical safety standpoint, regardless of the politics.
Right. And that leads on to my next point. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of the quote gun expert of my family.
Yeah.
I don't know if you are too. I'm assuming you're probably one of the more knowledgeable members of your family when it comes to firearms. But what if, a lot of the talk that we were discussing was like with your own children, but
Yeah.
because I'm the gun expert, I have a lot of family members like, I want you to talk to my niece and my nephew about this. Is that conversation any different if it's not your child?
I would say that there's a danger, right? And I say this about myself too, and I'll kind of bring it back to where I sort of try to follow this rule. There's a danger in trying to be the educator for the extended family or the friends group, because you always have to take it with a grain of salt that they're really respecting you as the educator as opposed to just some guy that can talk about something, right? So is it really have the impact that it would if you took them to something like our family firearm safety seminar, or they watched a video on the internet, even at this day and age, where there's a third party expert. It's not, Uncle Nick or whoever talking to someone about what's going on, right? It's really legitimately this person that sort of is put up on the pedestal as the expert and getting reinforcement from the family members and the parents. And hopefully, like whenever we do youth programs or in that family firearms seminar, we always empower, like, hey, we get the parents to shoot in front of the kids too, with the instructors watching, and we show the kids the parents following the rules, and we show the kids the parents handling the gun properly, and we let the parents stand behind the glass at the indoor range and watch the kids shoot and see them handling the gun properly and all that. So we try to create this relationship that doesn't undermine the obviously parent-child relationship, but really empowers them both to hold each other accountable in the appropriate ways, right? So you have to be careful at being the family member that teaches, in so much as even I don't teach, I mentioned I've been married a few times. Like I just send my wives, I've certified hundreds of instructors that are some of the best instructors in the world, right? Like if I'm dating someone, or if a friend of a friend or an old high school buddy wants me to teach his wife, it's usually a better, more professional educational environment to let someone else handle that. So it really depends on how far you're going. If it's talk a little bit about guns and why it's important to treat them respectfully, sure. If it's take the cousins to the range and teach them how to shoot, I think you're better off bringing in a third party, even if it's just another buddy of yours that may not know any more than you do, but at least set it up as, hey, it's not just the uncle or the buddy or the cousin talking to you. Here's the professional guy doing the professional thing. And I find kids get more out of that usually.
I do. I like that. That makes a lot of sense. So this is what I'm dealing with my children. I have one that is old enough and trustworthy enough to where I would let her pick up a firearm right now and I know nothing would happen. but she has absolutely no interest in it whatsoever. I have one that's young, wants to be shooting right now, and no, like that's not going to happen right now. Like you're not at that level. But my oldest, I want her to be able to, I don't want her to necessarily have the same passion I have when it comes to firearms. She has her own thing. I'm cool with that. Like, she can live her life. But I also want her to be able to pick up a gun and use it if she has to. What can you do, or what do you recommend to talk to children like that, where, you don't want them to be obsessed about it like you are, but you still want them to know how to use it and be safe?
Yeah, it's at some point it's a responsibility. It's a life lesson. If you have a fireplace, you talk about fireplace safety. If you have a wood burning stove, if you have a pool, you talk about locking the gate, and you don't swim alone or whatever it is, right? So if you had a big dog in the house, you would teach the kids different safety aspects of the dog. If they ride bikes, whatever. If there are guns in the home, then they need to be educated about those guns. Now, and you said, how old are they? 9 and
Right now they are 12 and 8.
okay, it was a 9 and 5 when you started, right?
Yep.
So 3 years now. You've had, you've acclimated. The family's acclimated. I assume you're taking, the right kind of responsible steps to prevent unauthorized access. All of that. When you start getting into 12 years old, 13, 14, 15, assuming the physical capability is there, absolutely. We, in a worst case scenario, there is that opportunity for her to defend herself when she's home alone, or defend the family. And we see stories like that every once in a while, where the teenager in the house protects themselves or protects the family with a gun. There is a world of difference between, taking her out to tactical classes with plate carriers and thinking about, saving them all from ISIS, and simply saying, hey, here's the code to the safe. You know how to use this AR or this 20 gauge shotgun or this 9mm handgun. I want you to be empowered and be responsibly trusted to be able to take care of this in a worst case scenario. And what, again, that means is formal training. And there is a world of difference also between the kid that wants to shoot, the hobbyist, right? The kid that wants to do IDPA and wants to do youth trap and all that other stuff, and the kid that you're simply saying, hey, you know how to use the fire extinguisher. You know how to call 911. I want you to show me that you can get to this gun, that you can access it quickly, that you remember the code, or you know where the key is, or we're going to program the biometric with your thumb. I want to see you get it ready. I want to see you barricade yourself in the room. I want to hear you pretend to call 911. And then we're going to go to the range, and I'm going to have you shoot at a man-sized target at 12, 15, 20 feet, whatever it is, across that, from the corner of that room to the door that you're locking and barricading behind where the gun is staged. I want to see you shoot the target, and that's it. Like it's just like knowing that you know how to use the fire extinguisher and where it is. It's a job. It's not a hobby. I'm not asking you to enjoy it. I'm asking for fun. I'm telling you this could save your life, and I want you to do that. And again, this all comes back to intellectual preparation and capability and mental maturity and sort of wisdom and awareness. When are they ready for that? You're going to know as a parent, but I think it's entirely appropriate to characterize it as you would any other emergency kind of life skill, as opposed to a hobby for that kid that's just not interested.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of people out there probably think Firearm Basics is more or less an optional life lesson to teach your children, especially for people who don't have firearms in the home or don't even think about that. Hopefully some of our listeners are people who, maybe they don't want to use firearms, and that's fine, but they're still wanting to learn more about them. I mean, how do you convince them that this is not an optional thing? This is something that you need to teach them, just like what to do when there's a fire in the house. And
I've had this conversation a lot with educators in, the public school system. And the idea is, I kind of start with, they'll ask me about gun safety or whatever. And it's like, well, here's the thing. In school, we teach our kids, sometimes on controversial topics, we teach them what we believe as a society they need to know to be safe. We teach them how to hold scissors. We teach them, we talk about safe sex. We talk about drug use, drug abuse, or the abuse of prescription pills. We talk about cigarette smoking. We talk about alcohol. We talk about some things that parents are squeamish about, or maybe would rather the things that weren't covered in school. But society has deemed these things are dangerous enough to kids and or important enough to our society that we're going to talk about. We teach kids about pollution, right? Like, so why, if the premise is guns are incredibly dangerous, why is our educational system so reticent and so horrified at the idea of teaching gun safety? It's clearly something that we can all agree guns can be dangerous, especially to the ignorant or the ill-informed and the curious kids. So why aren't we putting this in front of them as an educational standpoint? Well, that's where the politics come in. And it really is unfortunate. When people ask me, there's two questions that I answer with the same thing. Question number one, how do we change the American attitude towards firearms back to maybe what it was 100 years ago, where guns were commonplace, or 150 years ago where they were just part of everyday life? How do we get back to that? And the other question is, what's the best, most important, biggest thing we could do to reduce firearms deaths through negligence, I think it would also affect suicide, the use of firearms, things like that, and even some crime, because we're going to talk about the responsible ownership issues and securing guns from unauthorized access. And a lot of stolen guns obviously are used in crime. Both of those two problems are best addressed by mandatory firearms safety and responsibility education in our classrooms. Again, hundreds of millions of guns in our country. They're not going away probably ever, certainly not anytime soon. The generation of kids that are in school today are going to have firearms in their lives as kids and as adults. We owe it to them and to our society to educate them about the safe and responsible use, agnostically in terms of the politics. If you choose to have them, great. If you don't choose to have them, great. Don't care. I want you to know how they work, how they operate. And not only that, you can then become an advocate for responsible ownership. You don't have to be someone who hates guns. Guns are bad. I wish they weren't here. You were educating them about it in school. You know that what they are. And now when your friend is running around with one tucked in his waistband with no holster, and he doesn't have a safe, and he has kids in the house, you can be the person that says, hey man, come on. I get it. You're going to have a gun. Second Amendment. Yay. Get a holster and don't bring it to my house. I don't want it here. And when it's at your house, especially for your kids, lock it up in a safe. Like, those are the conversations that are going to come from this kind of just education and everyday conversations around guns for kids. And that's really what my latest book is about. It's about giving families a way to talk about guns that isn't part of the headlines and isn't, mass murder and isn't forcing you to become a gun lover or a gun loving family. It's just saying, hey, guns are all around us in our world. There are all kinds of people professionally and personally using, owning, carrying guns. Every kid is going to come into contact with them one way or another. We need to be able to have rational conversations about them and their existence.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think another question I guess I have then is, I'm a firearm owner, has firearms in my house. My kids are going to have friends over, and I don't necessarily know if their parents are okay with firearms being in the house. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. What tips do you have for that parent like me? If friends are coming over?
For sure. I've had the parents who weren't going to let kids come over to the house. And I've had the parents who said, hey, will you teach my kids about guns? Because you seem to know a lot about them. I know you have kind of every version of that, right? What I tell people is that you have no obligation to tell any other parent that you have guns in your house any more than, you have steak knives in the house or you have a fireplace or whatever else, right? If you had a dog that you knew nipped at kids, you would probably lock that dog up when your 9 or 10-year-old brought 9 or 10-year-olds over to the house, right? Like, just if the dog's nervous around kids, you're going to put the dog in the back room. Well, your gun shouldn't be laying out on the kitchen table either, right? Whether it's your kids or other people's kids, if you're securing your guns properly, there's no reason, you have no obligation to sort of warn people like it's a bad thing. Hey, I've got guns in the house. On the other hand, I don't think there's anything wrong with any parent asking another parent if they have guns in the home when their kids are going over there, and then to follow up with, a question about storage, or even if you just, hey, I know you're a hunter, I know you're a cop, I just want to ask my kids, you'll turn your back and he'll be on your top shelf of your closet. Like, I don't care if he finds your porn or your pot, but are your guns secure? I think it's fair for any parent, and people on our side, our team hates that, right? Well, it's none of their business if I have guns. Well, if they ask you if you had a dog, if they ask you if you had a pool, if they ask you if you, is there a fireplace? Because this kid's really curious about fire sometimes, how kids are. Mm-hmm. They're all rational, reasonable questions to parent. And I encourage gun owning families to ask other families, to force the conversation, to say, hey, do you have guns in the house? It's not a political thing. I have guns, but I keep our guns stored. I know my kid has gun safety. Do you guys have firearms in the house, and are they stored, secured safely or whatever? These should be normal questions that a responsible parent would ask. So I say, that to me is the biggest problem we have in our community, is like that parent asks you, hey, do you have guns in the house? And you get like backed into a corner and defensive, and your hackles go up like none of your business, right? Or why are you asking? What an opportunity to say to this person who might be nervous about guns and say, absolutely, I have guns in the house. And, if you want to come over, I'll kind of show you like how we have a safe, or I have a quick access safe. I stage some guns for defense, or my guns are all hunting guns. They're disassembled and this and that. I'd be happy to show you sometime. Do you shoot? Do you have guns? You want to go to the range? I mean, what an opportunity we have to demonstrate responsibility as gun owners and to engage people in a rational conversation about firearms, directly related to the reason that most of us have firearms ultimately is to protect our families and to protect our kids. So I think it should be a really open dialogue, one that gun owners are not afraid of or ashamed of or threatened by. And we need to really own that space a lot better than we do most of the time.
That makes a lot of sense. Kind of talking about the home defense plan here. And one of the first things you talked about was like barricading instead of just going out and trying to find the person. And that was crazy, because that blew my mind like right off the bat, because I've even done that, hear a noise in the night. But
so defend yourself, and actually did a really high quality audio book with Clint Macro, who's a great instructor, but he also is an audio engineer. So we did an audio book that people can get, the normal places, Audible, Amazon, whatever. It's and that book's actually one of my favorite books of all the books I've written. It's the most like A to Z comprehensive armed defense book. It talks about a lot of things other than just shooting. In fact, most of the book isn't about the shooting skill. I've written other books on that stuff. This is about a comprehensive armed defense home defense plan that includes being armed. And yeah, it's a real basic concept. Like, if you think there's a threat out there in your house and you've got your family in a room, why would you go expose yourself to danger when you can lock the door, call the police? You've got your gun, you've got your flashlight, got your medical kit, you got your 911 call's been made, your family's in there with you. Stay safe, stay secure. If the bad guy kicks the door in, shoot him. But what are you going to do? Go protect your 60-inch TV? You can replace it for $400 now. You don't expose yourself to more danger than you need, especially if your premise is defending yourself and your family. So yeah, the home defense plan that includes talking to kids about the reality of the guns being in the home for defense, and talking to kids about what they should do, and then running the drills, just like you run the fire drills at school. Hopefully you run some kind of a fire drill in your house. If you have kids on the second story and you have one of those rapid deployment ladders that they practice, climbing out of the second story. Well, it's the same thing. They practice locking the door. They practice going to the parents' room, or, what is the code for when you tell them to come to the room, when you're at their door and you want to knock on the door. And if you say, I'm here with Aunt Sally, that means don't open the door, because there is no Aunt Sally and there's a bad guy out here, or whatever. So these are really important concepts to talk to kids about. If you're the responsible parent who's saying, yeah, I'm going to be prepared to defend my family in the house, not the 3-year-old, but by the time they're 5, 6, 7, you should be talking to them about this stuff.
Well, continuing on the home defense plan, one of the things you talk about in that book was ease of access to your firearms through staging, and a lot of not only gun control laws out there right now, but even just gun safety tips from people in our own industry are: don't hide your firearms, for one, because kids are curious and they'll find them. I know that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, but that's number one. And the second one is to keeping your ammunition locked and your firearms locked, and more importantly, keep them locked in completely separate locations, which is kind of the antithesis of having a staged weapon.
The opposite of preparation for armed defense. So this is where we start getting this tricky area. So, I was going to mention this earlier, but this is a good time to mention it as well. The National Shooting Sports Foundation just launched a new campaign called Gun Owners Care. right? And you can learn more about it at gunownerscare.org. It was a big thing for them at SHOT Show this year, a couple of months ago. And the idea is that we need to demonstrate to people that gun owners are taking appropriate steps to mitigate the negative outcomes or potential negative outcomes of firearms in our society, in our lives as gun owners, because we care about ourselves, we care about our families first and foremost. And then obviously there is a political aspect to that. And one of the things I've said forever to gun owners is, look, if we don't demonstrate responsibility, there are plenty of people out there who will legislate their version of responsibility upon us, right? And that's what you're talking about. So if you look at like California, I think still has the most restrictive laws about how firearms and ammunition are to be stored. A lot of states have laws about how firearms and ammunition are to be stored in terms of preventing unauthorized access by children. If children can access the gun, you're in violation of the law, as opposed to, if their children don't have access to the gun. And I always sort of, roll my eyes a little bit at those kinds of laws. I mean, technically, like a 13-year-old could break the back window in my house, climb into the house, and find a gun that I have in a home that has no children in it. So ultimately, those laws really just exist to sort of like further, punish someone in the aftermath of a tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
We as firearms owners don't need laws. We should not need laws. We shouldn't certainly rebel against the idea of being responsible with a firearm just because there are laws. And this is my fear. And I get this kind of pushback sometimes. It seems like it's a hard concept to wrap your head around, but it's been so many years I've been active in this space that I can almost rationalize it. When I say to somebody like, hey, you really should lock your guns up, and their response as a gun owner is, I'm not going to do that just because the anti-gunners want me to lock my guns up. It's like, this has nothing to do with anti-gunners wanting you to lock your guns up, man. It has to do with responsible firearms ownership. And locking a gun up, locking a loaded gun in a holster inside of a quick access safe that takes a second and a half or half a second, depending on the biometric or the push button or the enter the code and turn the knob or whatever it is you have to do. This is not someone oppressing you. This is being a responsible gun owner. And understanding the difference is, I guess, somewhat nuanced for some people, but to me, it's really obvious. Whether there's a law in place or not, I don't want my 4-year-old or her 5 or 6 or 3-year-old friend stumbling across a loaded gun. I also don't want to have to keep my gun taken apart in 3 different places in my house because there's a 4-year-old running around. I'd much rather have it assembled with in my AR assembled with a loaded magazine in it inside of a safe, so I can just pop that safe open, run the charging handle, and I'm ready to defend my 4-year-old and myself and anybody else in the environment. This is the idea of staging, is how can I have a gun that is accessible and ready, but not accessible to someone who isn't authorized, whether that's the home invader, the kid, the drunk friend that's over for a party and instead of going to the bathroom wanders into the bedroom and starts going through the closet. Like, whatever it is, I want that gun under my control, even when it's not under my direct supervision. And that's what a quick access safe and staging does for you. Now, I have said in the past, like, sometimes hiding a gun is a version of staging, right? So in other words, a loaded shotgun, the proverbial, tucked behind the couch cushion or whatever, or at least loaded in the tube with nothing in the chamber. Is that a staged defensive gun? Sure. Are you preventing unauthorized access? Not to anybody who already has access to your home. So if you have the roommate, have the kids, that gun is not secured from unauthorized access. If you're a bachelor living in a 1-bedroom efficiency in some city somewhere, and you've got a shotgun that has a round, no round in the chamber, but the tube loaded, and you know where it is and you know where you can grab it quickly, but it's not inside of a safe, is that reckless or negligent? I don't think so. The minute you have a poker party and you got a bunch of friends who are over drinking and that gun's just leaned up, behind your door in the bedroom, now it becomes reckless. And having the wisdom and the understanding to differentiate between those two things is part of being a responsible gun owner. So it's not because of the law. Certainly, I don't advocate people with guns in California violate the law, but there are plenty of ways to be inside of that law and still have a gun that is relatively quickly accessed. Is it as quick as somebody in Alabama who can have the gun loaded in the safe? No. But in California, you can still have, the ammunition here, the gun here, and, in less than 10 seconds, have the loaded gun with the ammunition ready to defend your family. And ultimately, the other thing we cover in that book is what are the scenarios And when you read the book, I did a book called Counter Ambush a couple years before Defend Yourself. When you get into the neuroscience and the circumstances of most armed defensive moments, the issue of I had the gun 1 second or I had the gun in 3 seconds really isn't the issue. You're not dive rolling over your bed and, coming up like James Bond shooting the intruder that was on your heels. That's not the way these things play out. So the difference between a secured gun that was staged properly and a gun that was loaded and in the open shouldn't be the matter of life and death. And it can tragically be the difference between life and death when that kid finds the gun.
Exactly. Yeah. And it seems like a lot of like the people in our industry kind of preach on the whole, if it's not loaded, there's one in the chamber at all times. Like you don't have a chance. Like you're done. Like
it's just not the case with the vast majority of circumstances, especially when it comes to home defense or workplace defense.
Mm-hmm.
If you're wearing the gun, obviously you want one in the chamber. If the gun's not on your body, if the trick for me is the trigger controlled or not. If the gun's in a holster, there's a trigger guard on it inside of that box, inside of the safe, put around in the chamber. If there isn't something covering that trigger, you don't want to be reaching into the box and at night in a rush, maybe in a panic, and have a live trigger with a gun that has a round in the chamber, right? An exposed trigger. So that's really the only difference. If you stage it with the trigger covered, then sure, have a round in the chamber. If not, then it should be somewhere or it shouldn't be that big a deal to take the gun and rack the slide when you put it into the context of home defense.
Mm-hmm. Switching course here a little bit to kind of the school area, school situation, and kind of going back, I think I misspoke and said one of your first rules was barricade, but I believe the first rule was actually evading.
It's evade first is getting away, and then barricade is the one that I think a lot of people, as you said, in the home defense, that's really the one that blows people's minds, because you hear a lot about clearing the house. Like, I gotta go clear, I gotta go check, something's going on out there, I need to know what's going on. No, you don't. No, if you know where your family is, your family is safe. If you think there's a threat out there, you don't need to go clear your house. And guess what? I've worked with a lot of military teams and law enforcement teams that are very experienced and very well practiced that miss things when they clear buildings as a unit in a training environment. So the idea that you and your wife or you and your 12-year-old are going to clear your house, that's fantasy camp. You really need to know how to move through your house to get to a barricade area, to get to where your family is. Absolutely. And when we talk about school environments or the mall or wherever else, evading, right, knowing how to move while you're armed and doing it responsibly and safely in a way that you're prepared to defend yourself or others from any threats you encounter, absolutely, that's important. That's very different from hunting for the bad guy.
Yeah, and then so in schools, my co-host who wasn't here tonight, but both of our wives are teachers, and in their school, and in a lot of schools, the very first thing is the lockdown. It's hide in your room and wait. There's no evading. There's no get out the window if the shooter's clearly on the other side of the school or anything like that. Is there anything? Is there a reason why that's the rule? Because I know some schools, the first rule is evade. It's not just lock down and sit there and wait. Is it just they're unsure of the capabilities of the children or the teachers?
There's two things. The first one is that the original I call it hide and hope. The original lockdown came from law enforcement, right? Because naturally schools went to law enforcement and said, what should we do? Well, law enforcement's mindset was, well, how do we make our job easier? How to make it less likely that we hurt the wrong kid? We want you guys locked down, literally hiding in the corner, hiding under your desk, packed into a closet, get out of the way and get down on the ground or back into a corner so that when we show up, the only person who's running around and moving that we see should be the threat, the bad guy who's trying to find people. We have clear lanes to shoot, and it's going to be easy for us to find that person because all of the good people should be static. Right. So that's really where that originally comes from. And it kind of makes sense if you've got a SWAT team on the campus all the time, because now all the good guys hit the deck. The SWAT team's going to be there within 30 seconds or 2 minutes, and we're going to find the bad guy. Okay. But when it might take 20 minutes for the cops to get to where you're going to be, and certainly it's going to take 10, in almost every case, when we've got to get the SWAT team, when we've got to get those professionals there to do what they're supposed to do, it does not make sense to just tell the kids to hide and hope that the police get there before the bad guy does, because that's essentially what we do with lockdown. Is if the bad guy gets into that room before the good guys do, those kids die. And when things started to change, where it was Sandy Hook. In Sandy Hook, there was one room where it was over 20 kids and the teacher all got killed or at least severely injured. The only kids that survived in that one room were the kids that ran out. There were 4 or 5 of them that ran past the shooter when the shooter came into the room and opened the door. And that moment sank in for a lot of people, including a lot of law enforcement organizations that were teaching the lockdown, hide and hope response methodology. And they said, we're really setting these kids up for failure. If they can get away from the campus, if they can get away from the shooter, we need to empower that and allow that. It was actually a school system in Houston that started the run, hide, fight concept. And then that went all the way up to the White House and through the FBI into a White House task force. And that became the Department of Homeland Security's mantra, was run, hide, fight. Probably within a year or 18 months of Sandy Hook. When I launched the SARC program, the School Attacker Response Course, there were several other programs that launched much faster because we aren't, the bureaucracy of the federal government. We were able to get a program in place for a lot of schools and put this at least in front of schools for consideration. And ours was evade, barricade, and respond as appropriate. Because if you'd have asked me in 2012 if the federal government was ever going to put out a program that literally said fight, that had something that was aggressive or assertive in it, 100% no way that was ever going to happen. Right. And a lot of us were very, very pleasantly surprised that the government has been advocating for kids to learn how to fight, and school systems have been teaching kids that they may need to fight. And I think that's a huge step politically and socially for our culture to remind kids, because I'm sure your generation, my generation, for a couple of generations in our school systems, kids have been told there is never an appropriate time to fight. Even if the bully is tipping over the kid in the wheelchair, you can't grab that kid to make him stop. That you're doing something wrong. You're both going to get suspended, kind of thing, right? Well, now we're teaching kids to fight against a guy with an AR-15 in their classroom using, a stapler and scissors and a chair and a ball bat and their coats to throw over his head. That has to change our culture in a way that's going to be positive and empowering for people to understand that they do need to stand up for themselves.
Okay, so I want to stay respectful of your time. I know you're, based off of some of your posts, it looks like you're doing your family thing right now. So again, I appreciate you taking the time to be on our show. So remembering what you just said, because I'm going to kind of move on to the next thing here, relating to that. Because of the increased amount of school shootings, there's been a market flood of products like bulletproof panels, bulletproof backpacks. I've even bought a bulletproof panel myself for my child, and she complained how heavy it was and everything like that. Have you seen anything out there that you would recommend, or do you think these products are actually worthwhile?
Yeah, I personally have a Premier body armor panel in my backpack carry-on that's with me all the time. And in my most recent marriage, the high school aged kids, starting in middle school, actually, were carrying the same ones, the Premier body armor panels in their backpacks, because they really aren't that heavy. And I like them, as much as anything else, it's a reminder of the world we live in has violence, and whether it's school violence or personal violence or, just the violence of war and, like intercontinental violence. It's a good reminder for kids that they can be prepared. I think the danger a lot of people think is, well, if we run these kinds of, shooter response drills, and if we give kids bulletproof panels, and if we have bulletproof whiteboards in the classrooms, kids are going to be scared. Well, preparation shouldn't create paranoia. Preparation should create confidence, So I think for kids, it's a little bit of letting them know you care. It's a little bit of letting them know that they shouldn't just, give up all hope because there's some danger or violence in the world, that they are prepared to survive. They can be empowered to defend themselves. I think some of those products are really good ideas. And one area that's really come a long way is rapid locking, rapid barricading systems for schools. So while I said earlier, like barricading in terms of just saying lock down, don't worry, the good guys will get there and save you. That's not a good approach. But there are times when, you're on a higher floor of a school, or the shooter is out in the hallway and you're trapped in a classroom. You're not going to jump out the window. You're not going to run into the hallway and risk getting shot. So being able to barricade and quickly lock and secure a room, whether it's an outward opening or an inward opening door, there are some great products out there for schools. And certainly medical technology, teaching your kids about trauma medicine and teaching your kids about emergency medical response in the aftermath of violence is another way that we can empower kids and prepare schools that is sort of gear related, but also I think there's some big implicit, not just explicit life skills that can be taught, but some really good implicit messaging about kids being prepared to help one another and to survive tragedy. Even if it's a rollover accident or an earthquake, medical skills can be super valuable with or without, a violent attacker being, part of that equation. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to capitalize on the conversations and empower our kids, educate our kids, and make them take their defense seriously while not being paranoid. Because, we do have to remember that ultimately, the biggest mass shooting in history in the U.S. in Las Vegas, 58 people killed October 1st, a couple of years ago. There's one of those every day with firearms suicides. Every single day in the U.S., if you amortize the number of suicides every year, there's between 55 and 65 people die. These are the tragedies that we can address every day. How many kids bleed to death in car accidents that maybe one of the other kids could have saved them, or the next person driving by that accident could have saved them if they had medical skills and maybe some minimal medical gear with them. These are the types of lessons that I think that we can capitalize on, these conversations that really are sensationalizing the frequency of mass violence or firearms violence in our culture. But let's, take it back. Let's make it a win for society by empowering our kids. And there are definitely some products out there that are worth talking about when it comes to the armor panels and the security devices, and especially the medical equipment.
Awesome. Yeah. I know that could probably be a whole nother episode on itself. And, if you're willing, I would love to talk to you more about that in particular.
Oh yeah. I got to tell you, to me, a lot of people, I get a lot of flack sometimes from, the diehards, the tough guy 37 Instagram accounts or whatever, because I readily admit that I don't always have a gun. I travel internationally. I don't carry when I drink. There are times and places when I don't have a gun, but I almost always have my ankle trauma medical kit on me when I'm on a plane, when I'm in Europe, when I'm out at a bar. Right now my backpack is, I don't know, 8 feet from me. And inside that backpack is that Premier Body Armor ballistic panel, emergency medical gear. I'm wearing an ankle kit with medical gear on it. But I had a couple drinks with dinner, a couple glasses of wine, so the guns are secure down here. I got a bunch of family members that are drinking. There's kids in the house, so the guns are locked up right now. Now I could access those guns, but I'm wearing the medical equipment. Basically, if I'm dressed and in public, I'm certainly probably wearing that medical kit. And there are definitely times and places on this planet where I can't carry a firearm. And the way we think about preparation and the way we think about personal defense shouldn't be all about the gun. I think that's a really important lesson, and especially circling back to kids. Obviously, we're not going to, have our 5-year-olds carrying pistols in kindergarten, but they can be aware of concepts like evade. And our 12-year-olds probably aren't going to be carrying ARs in middle school, but they can be aware of emergency, medical response concepts.
That's awesome. Yeah. And if it's okay with you, on our show notes, I'm going to put a link to that Premier Body Armor and then some of the other programs that you talked about, the SARC, and then that program in Houston, just for other people's reference.
Sure, absolutely, yes. School Attacker Response Course still has a Facebook page and a website with some resources out there, and certainly personaldefensenetwork.com, which I've been running, since 2010. We put the website up 2005. We started the DVD training series. All of these topics and demonstrations of the medical equipment and the body armor, and talking about the school response programs. All of that is available in literally hundreds of pieces of free content at personaldefensenetwork.com.
Awesome. Yeah. I think, since we have you on the show, I mean, that pretty much wraps up the questions I had at this time regarding children and their relationship with firearms. But since I have you on there, just one more question, just based off of your years of training. And, I was listening to some of the interviews you've given, and I listened to that book you did. One of the things that I was wondering is, just, you teach a combination of private citizens, law enforcement, military. Is there anything different you feel after training these different groups? For example, if I was a trainer, I think it'd be more unsettling knowing that when I'm training law enforcement or military, like, they're going to go out and use that training, or I guess the potential to use that training right away is 1,000% more likely than just teaching a private citizen.
Yeah, as far as the weight that comes with that, I think if I understand the question, it's the mindset I go into those classes or I leave those classes with. At first, it absolutely, the first time I was invited to train Green Berets, for example, they were the first, really high-end military team that I had the opportunity to provide some training to. And it was really a bit of an interview and a test or an evaluation of a program I was running for close quarters counter ambush and integrated defense, armed and unarmed, to see if they were going to kind of take this program on. Ultimately, they did. And we even ended up with a sole source provider contract on that program for a number of years in the mid 2000s for the Army side. And then we ended up teaching another version to the Navy side as well for naval special warfare. And those were great honors, and they carried a lot of weight and a lot of responsibility. And certainly those were the guys that were, almost inevitably going to be put to the test, or some of the things that I taught them and my team taught them were going to be put to the test, and evaluated in the most ultimate way you possibly could be evaluated. And that is heavy. But the other side of that coin is those guys also have, months and years of training and operational experience that they carry into whatever event they're going to face in the future after they go to a class with me. So while I may think, my 3 days with them or 5 days with them was an incredibly important, evolution, it's still one of, it's like 0.002% of what they get. On the other hand, the civilian that comes to a combat focused shooting program or takes an advanced home defense tactics class with me, they may only have gotten a 4-hour, almost worthless, NRA basic pistol, get your concealed carry permit class. They may have shot some IDPA or grew up hunting or whatever, but the only 3 days of training they're ever going to get that's in any way practically related to that life and death moment they might face is the 3 days they spent with me or my team. So it carries a different kind of weight when you realize that. And I would hate to think there are instructors out there that do train civilians and train law enforcement and somehow think, well, this isn't as important because I'm only training civilians today. When the reality is you probably are all they will get, or at least a huge percentage of what they will ever get that prepares them for their life and death moment, as opposed to that Navy SEAL that, I may make him 0.02% more dangerous or more survivable, increase his survivability by 0.02% in this situation that aligns with the course he took with me. But that guy goes into it with a whole hell of a lot of support and awareness and prior training and future training and operational experience. Whereas that guy that works at UPS, all he has is what I can convey to him in those 3 days and what he practices based on that. So it's still really, really big and important. And, I hope every instructor thinks about it that way, because I think it is not the way I think the average person, thinks about it off the cuff, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, to your point, there's a class I'm going to be taking in the near future. It's kind of a, it's like a close quarter battle pistol class, but based on, your home scenario or maybe your office setting. And yeah, like, it's a 4-hour class. And to your point, like, if you're training someone in the military, that, like you said, it's 0.001% improvement on what they already know. But to me, that 4 hours is going to be a 1,000% improvement on what I knew going into it.
Right.
And one of the things I liked is, what actually brought me, or what made me think of this question, was in one of your stories, you said a service member came back from that tour of duty and came back and was like, and actually gave you that validation and said, hey, what you taught us before we deployed worked.
Yeah. That's just huge honor to hear that. And, to get that kind of feedback certainly is validating. I always take it a little bit with a sobering kind of grain of salt too. I mean, I think for decades we've had people say, their training got them through a fight but then since we've had dash camera videos and body cameras and surveillance cameras and combat cameras, we also, aerial surveillance, we also know that a lot of things get improvised during fights.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of things get improvised, and people, maybe in spite of their training, in some cases have survived tragic events as well, critical incidents. But I will tell you that what I most value is when guys who have had those experiences over and over again, when military units, law enforcement, when they have gotten past the curve of the one time it happened to them, and they, as a unit especially, evaluate something that we're offering, and they say, yeah, this fits, that makes sense, or that's a piece of the puzzle that we haven't, seen that approach to, and it resonates with us. We think there's value in it. And then certainly when they come back, 6 months or 6 years later and say, hey, there was this moment when it was exactly like that scenario, or it was exactly like the drill we did, or it was exactly like that. And it's humbling. It reminds you real quick, just, how important what we're doing is, and how seriously it needs to be taken, or you need to, get out of the game and just go shoot IDPA or something.
Awesome. Well, I before we wrap things up, I just wanted to let you know, this was really a great honor to have you on the show. I probably have about 10 hours worth more questions in my head that I want to ask you, but to wrap things up, how do people reach you? How do you want them to get a hold of you?
Any social media. I run all my own social media. So Pincus Rob at Twitter, Pincus Rob at Instagram, Facebook / Rob Pincus or Rob Pincus Pro. If you follow my Instagram, or if you go to my regular Facebook page, you're going to get pictures of the steak I cook, and my 4-year-old and I going on some road trip adventure or something. But if you stick with Rob Pincus Pro, or if you go to personaldefensenetwork.com, it's much more of just the training information over at PDN. Rob Pincus Pro, I do get into the politics and the gun rights advocacy and suicide prevention and all the other things I'm into, not just training. But I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. Again, PDN is the place to go for the training information, and intuitiveshooting.com has the ICE training company, I.C.E. training company. That's the company that I run all my live fire training and in-person classes through, so you can find the calendar there. I'm also about to launch the 2020 Personal Defense Network Training Tour. We'll have 12 other instructors with me. We'll do about 120 classes between March and August around the country, and that's pdntrainingtour.com. I really appreciate you having some great questions and letting me share some thoughts and ideas with your audience. And, I'd love to see you in a class sometime, and, maybe get your whole family together in a class or something sometime. And definitely would love to be on the show again for some more of those questions in the future.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, man.
Thank you for listening to Trigger Discipline. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Links are in the description.
You can view our website at triggerdiscipline.info, or contact us with any suggestions or questions you have at contact@triggerdiscipline.info.